to go over the part of World War II that you likely did not cover as much when you did US history in middle school, and usually does not get as much of the sort of front page World War II sort of stuff as we will see later on. So today we'll be going through 1942, 1943, and taking a peek into 1944 with the Russian campaign. So 3 slides looking for us today. The first 2 are going to be sort of bisected into different theaters, as we'll see as we go forward. So let's get rolling. First off, 1942 in the Pacific. This is where America is really going to first start showing up for World War II. We've declared war. We've begun to mobilize. The first people that are going to be deployed are going to be Marines, with the help of the U.S. Navy, and a couple Army units, not a ton of them. Most of those are going to end up fighting in, I guess what we could call the European theater later on. So not to diminish the Army, but the Army is going to take a backseat to the Marines in the Pacific. So the British are involved in the Pacific War as well, just not as much as you normally hear about. They're busy up in this area right here trying to stop the Japanese from getting into India, taking over rubber plantations. The Japanese are down here right now because there is a ton of rubber down there as well as a ton of gasoline. If you've heard of Shell, the gas company, it used to be Royal Dutch Shell, and as you can see right here, the Netherlands controlled the what is now Indonesia at the time. So the Japanese are really looking to get in there, and the Allied forces are looking to deny them that. America does a phenomenal job dealing without getting the raw rubber that we were used to from the Netherlands. Instead, we create synthetic rubber and create massive amounts of it. Also, we got a decent amount from Brazil, who we were technically allied with at the time. So early 1942, the remainder of the U.S. forces in the Philippines, right here, which were still controlled by the United States. You all remember the Spanish-American War. Those troops are captured in January, and their commanding officer, Douglas MacArthur, vows to return. Well, there's 2 schools of thought about this. One says that he does the exact right thing and he leaves his troops there so he can rally more troops in Australia and come back and rescue them. The other one says he's looking out for his own best interest, both of which are probably true. Douglas MacArthur is, to put it gently, a divisive figure in American and in military history. Sometimes he's an amazing leader and sometimes he's an egotistical blowhard, and most of the time he's both. So MacArthur and his family and the president of the Philippines catch a plane out. They fly, well, they catch a boat and then they catch a plane, and they end up in Australia, which is one of our allies. He's immediately going to start asking for help. The soldiers that are caught are captured on what is called the Bataan Peninsula, Bataan, and they are ruthlessly marched across the peninsula in sweltering jungle heat with massive disease. They've already basically been under siege for a couple of months, so they're grossly dehydrated and malnourished and very, very sick. And the Japanese take them on what is now called the Bataan Death March, which essentially meant that if any of the American soldiers or their Philippine allies tried to stop for a break or anything, they would be left to die or they would be killed on the spot. As we will see going forward, this is standard operating procedure for the Japanese military at this time. They are in, I guess what you could call almost a cultish belief that what they're doing is right, and in the name of the emperor who they worship as a god. And as a result of that, they do not take surrender, which we in the Western world take as part of war, seriously. They view it as shameful, and they're far more likely to kill surrendering prisoners than they are to actually take them prisoner. If they do take them prisoner, they are horribly mistreated and usually left up to their own devices. If you got more questions on that, I can go into it later. But anyway, MacArthur vows to return. Early on, we have this right here called the Battle of the Coral Sea. So as you can see, the Coral Sea is a hop, skip, and a jump from the Australian coast, which is essentially the American staging ground and the British staging ground for any battle that is going to happen in this entire area. So the Battle of the Coral Sea is going to be a couple things, but the biggest thing is It is the first all-carrier battle. So this is all between aircraft carriers. The ships fighting each other never actually see each other. This is planes taking off and bombing other ships miles and miles and miles away. It ends in a draw. The U.S. gets smacked around. The Japanese get smacked around. Nobody realizes how bad off the other side is and really presses the advantage. But the key for the continuation of the war is this stops the Japanese from pushing closer to Australia. So this is sort of a rebuke to the Japanese, and the Japanese are going to fall back. As this is all going on, battleships are being constantly made in North America, and they're being shipped over at all times. The U.S. fleet, the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, is gearing up. There are more and more ships there. People are very, very well trained for this. And now the question becomes, well, now that we know the Japanese are out there and they're looking to hurt our fleet, what can we do to hurt their fleet instead? And eventually what happens is the U.S. is going to crack the Japanese naval code. Well, more specifically, they're going to crack about 20% of it. So they'll be able to pull certain words out, and there is a code-breaking office in Pearl Harbor whose sole job it is to go through all of this stuff. And they realize after breaking a code that they think they've identified the name for what Japan calls Midway Island, which is basically a fueling stop. It's an old coaling station that we got during the Spanish-American War. And so it's literally midway in the Pacific between Asia and the Americas. That's why it's called Midway. And so they realize this, and they decide that what they're going to do is they're going to lay a trap for the Japanese Navy. So what they do is they send out a code that says the water purifier on Midway Island is broken. And the Japanese pick this up, like the Americans knew they would, and they basically send it out and confirm that the code breakers on Pearl Harbor had it right. So the Japanese send a ton of their ships, including a number of aircraft carriers, with all of their most experienced pilots, combat veterans from Pearl Harbor and other attacks throughout the Pacific at this time. And they send them all over to take Midway, because if they can take Midway, then the U.S. isn't going to be able to refuel as efficiently, to control the Pacific with their ships. And also, as you can see, it's a relatively short way from Midway to the Hawaiian Islands. And if you take the Hawaiian Islands, then you've basically denied the Americans access to the Pacific, and they would have all but won the war if the Japanese can take Midway Island. So what's going to happen here is the original commander of the U.S. Fleet is actually going to get sick. He gets a really, really bad skin infection, and he can't go. So his number two guy takes over, and what's going to happen is through a series of amazing luck and just dogged determination by U.S. fighter pilots, they are going to find and ambush the Japanese fleet on its way to Midway, and eventually they are going to destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Now, this is a big deal in its own part, but the larger thing that's actually going to come out of this is that because the Japanese were so confident they were going to win this, and the first wave of American attacks did not actually affect the aircraft carriers at all. Long story short, we missed repeatedly. The Japanese decide that what they want to do is they're going to switch over from one type of ammunition to another type of ammunition, and they're going to switch out all of this ammunition for these planes on the decks of the ships, which seems like a great idea because they believe that they have just fended off the U.S. attack and that's it. That is not, in fact, it. There is another wave of U.S. Fighter bombers coming in, and they are going to hit the Japanese aircraft carriers while they are refueling and rearming these ships. So the entire tops of these Japanese aircraft carriers are filled with the following: gasoline, bullets, 500-pound bombs, and most importantly, the cream of the crop of the Japanese pilots. They're all there. They're all waiting to get back into their planes and go attack the U.S. ships that had just attacked them. And instead, we are going to get this absolute carnage. The American Navy is going to wipe out really any offensive capability that the Japanese fleet would have had. It is a phenomenal victory, and I would argue that this is the single most important thing that is going to happen in the entirety of the War of the Pacific. We will talk about the most important thing that happens in the European War in a little bit. But the Battle of Midway, I cannot express enough how important this is. This ensures that American ships will control the Pacific and the U.S. Navy will dictate the pace and the location of the entirety of the Pacific War going forward, because it is going to allow for this. Of course, that little thing pops up. It's going to allow for something called island hopping. What's going to happen here is American planners are going to realize that, hey, if the Japanese Navy can't come in and attack our ships all the time anymore, then what we can do is we can move our troops from one island to another. We can skip the islands that the Japanese have really reinforced, and we can just go to the islands that we need to take. So they need to take a couple over here in the Solomons. They need to take this one called Guadalcanal. They'll move up here to New Guinea, and they will continue to bounce from island to island to island with the intent of getting closer to Japan. Now, the islands that they pick, why do they pick them? They're going to pick them because they have airfields on them. And that's going to be this war, is the Navy will continue to hunt down Japanese ships and transport troops. They will also have a number of aircraft carriers to fly planes off of. But we are going to move those troops so they can take over airfields. Those airfields then can be used to bomb the next position, and we can basically hopscotch along through the entirety of the Pacific, avoiding conflict whenever possible, and basically leaving the Japanese troops that are on these islands to just kind of starve, as they're not going to have any reinforcements there, or what reinforcements they have won't do any good because there won't be anybody to fight against. But because of the Battle of Midway, and in later battles, the Japanese Navy is going to fall apart so much that they're not going to be able to reinforce or move Japanese troops. So that is why the Battle of Midway is so important, and 1942 is going to mark the turning point in the war. So we start turning stuff around pretty dang quickly. Let's keep going. Now, on the other side of the world, we are in Africa. The U.S. Army, remember we talked about Franklin Roosevelt instituting the draft a while back. These troops are finally trained and ready to fight. What you see on your left here are Sherman tanks, which we have made with massive numbers thanks to our mobilization on the home front. Good side, bad side of the Sherman tank. Good side, we make it super fast. They're speedy little guys. Downside, they're not particularly well armored, so they can get beaten up pretty easily. The one other upside, though, is because we have such a great factory system back in the U.S., is once we realize, for example, that the guns on the tanks are not strong enough to puncture German tanks, which are much stronger and much better armored, we're going to switch out the guns. We're going to make it a bit larger caliber. And by the time we roll into Northern Europe in 1944, they'll be bigger and we'll be able to do better against them. So the big thing, and like it says right up here, 1942 is about hard lessons for America. Like we saw, Coral Sea did not go particularly well. But we learn from it, we do better, we win the Battle of Midway. In Africa, this is going to be the American Army's growing pains here. And it's going to take place with what is called Operation Torch. Dwight Eisenhower, as we said earlier, is the Supreme Allied Commander over here. He is going to work in conjunction with a gentleman named Bernard Montgomery, who is the leading general for the British. I don't like Bernard Montgomery. We're not going to talk about him a lot until we have to. Long story short, he does well here. He screws up everything else he's ever going to do. So, the point of Operation Torch is to take over North Africa and kind of get American troops blooded almost, and also hang on to the oil fields in Northern Africa that the Allies are going to need. America's first big battle is going to be the Battle of the Kasserine Pass. It's going to be a disaster. They are not prepared. Our tanks get absolutely worked over, like I just referred to. But two generals are going to learn a lot from this. Those two generals will be Generals Omar Bradley and General George S. Patton. They will adapt. They will get their troops better. They will train them up, and they will continue to push forward. On the other side of Africa, so Kasserine Pass is in sort of central North Africa. El Alamein is in Egypt. British troops are going to push the Germans under a guy named Erwin Rommel, also known as the Desert Fox, out of Africa. After kind of an embarrassing loss a year earlier, the British troops under, as I said, our British friend whose name shall not be spoken, they're going to push the German troops up into Tunisia, which is sort of the little nub on the top of Africa. And at the same time, Generals Bradley and Patton are going to help roll in at the end there with their much better trained troops a couple months in and push Rommel's forces, that is the remainder of the Germans and the remainder of the Italians that were fighting there, out of Tunisia and thus out of Africa. So what's going to happen then is those troops, those Axis troops, are going to retreat to Sicily, which is the soccer ball that the Italian boot is kicking, and back to Italy itself. The Allies are pretty happy about this, with the exception of Joseph Stalin, because as Winston Churchill, the leader of the UK, sees it, Europe's soft underbelly is exposed. The Italian troops did not have a good showing during Operation Torch. For the most part, they had command taken away and given to the Germans because they could not be trusted. So what Churchill sees here is an opportunity to invade Italy and then punch up into southern Germany once Italy is taken. As we will see in a little bit, easier said than done, but by the end of 1942, the Allies are in increasing control of the Pacific. They are holding North Africa, and they're preparing to attack into southern Europe. Let's keep rolling. 1943 has a lot of relatively small things happen. This is probably the least heralded year in the entirety of what happens in World War II because it's the calm before the storm. This is prelude to the big stuff that they make a ton of movies about. We'll start with the Pacific. So Nimitz here is the Navy. So the Navy's pushing in to just kind of try to get from spot to spot. They don't really mind as much about the fighting that is going on the islands. Whereas MacArthur is leading the ground troops to push the Japanese out of New Guinea, and they're aiming to get from New Guinea to Peleliu to the Philippines. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So, as I said last time, the key to the Pacific is airfields, and the first big airfield we are going to take is Guadalcanal. Now, this battle starts in 1942, but I put it here because it ends in early 1943. Guadalcanal is the Americans' first big land victory in the Pacific. This goes on for months. They're fighting in jungle. They're also fighting against disease that is coming from everywhere all the time. And the Japanese do not fight like Western soldiers. So Germans, Russians, Americans, French, English, whomever. As I said, there's that sense of surrender. The Japanese don't believe in that. They will execute banzai charges, which are essentially suicide charges at American-held positions held by machine guns, and will get mowed down in the hopes that their body will act as cover for the person coming after them. The Japanese are an unforgiving and horribly, horribly violent foe. But eventually Guadalcanal will be taken. If you guys have seen the show The Pacific, it's on Amazon Prime. You have nothing better to do. The first couple episodes of that series deal with Guadalcanal and a couple people winning medals of honor on Guadalcanal at a place called Henderson Field, which is pretty interesting, but we do not, unfortunately, have time to go into that. If we were in class right now, you'd see the massive amount of notes I'm just staring at right now, wishing I could get to you, but, you know, for the sake of time, we'll cut it short. Island hopping is going to do better and better. Basically, it's proven at this point. This is what we are going to do. So over the next couple of months leading into 1944, this area, parts of New Guinea will be taken. We will then be pushing up to sort of here, and we're going to kind of get past the Marshalls pretty quickly. But by the time we get into our next one, the American allies are sort of here. So things are going well in the Pacific, but it is just horribly violent, and in a sort of world and in a biosphere that the Americans are not used to or prepared for. Okay, now we are again going to swing over to Europe. And first, we got to talk about Italy. In Italy, In 1943, Joseph Stalin has just won a crushing victory over the Germans, which we will talk about in about 5 minutes. And he's saying, hey, Allies, you guys need to take some pressure off of me because I feel like I'm the only one fighting the Germans. And he's right. He's the only one with troops fighting the Germans in Italy. The Americans and the British are bombing the absolute crap out of all German manufacturing in some German cities, but that is not enough. So, just to introduce you to our players, this is Joseph Stalin again. This is Franklin Roosevelt, and this tub of goo over here is the wonderful Winston Churchill. Stalin is in charge of Russia, FDR obviously the American president, and Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of England. Not a particularly great politician, but an amazing leader. So here we go. U.S., long story short, is not prepared to invade France yet, which is the big plan. The initial plan was, hey, in 1943, we're going to invade France. We'll be ready for this. Eventually, it comes out that while both General Marshall, the head of the American Army, and General Eisenhower both want to invade Europe via France, we're simply not prepared for it. And if we were to go in, it would result in massive casualties and probably a failure. So, what is decided instead is that the Allies will embark on Operation Husky. We are going to invade Sicily, which, as I said a minute ago, is the soccer ball that the Italian boot is kicking. General George Patton right here, who we talked about on the last slide as well, is crazy. He's an amazing general, but he also believes in reincarnation and that he can talk to the dead and that he has some mystical destiny and everything else. He's also just an egotistical jerk. But he's a very good leader. He is going to essentially race Bernard Montgomery across Sicily. They're taking two different routes. He is going to win a ton of fame and accolades for this, which he will lose almost immediately because in the aftermath of this, he's going to go into a hospital with a bunch of troops suffering from what was then called shell shock, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He calls two of them cowards and slaps one of them across the face in front of a bunch of reporters. He's taken out of command and basically sent back to the U.S. for a hot second, and then he's going to hang out in England and try to redeem himself later on. At the same time this is happening, the Japanese Americans are going to start to show up in the military. They're called the Nisei. That is a colloquial term among Japanese. It's sort of like a slang term for like first-generation Americans. And they are going to create the 100th Infantry Battalion, and they are going to do a phenomenal job throughout the Italian campaign. So obviously the Americans, considering that they're locking their family members up, don't trust these Japanese Americans to go fight in the Pacific where, speaking Japanese might be a giant help in translating. No. Instead, we are going to send them over, and the Nisei and the 100th Infantry Battalion are going to spend most of the war fighting their way up through Italy. Because as you see here, Husky only deals with Patton invading Sicily. What's going to come after this is what's called Operation Avalanche. Operation Avalanche is that soft underbelly strategy that Winston Churchill likes so much. So the Americans and the British are going to land on the west coast of Italy and try to push up. The Italians are going to drop out within about a year, and the Nazis are going to fight tooth and nail, especially for northern Italy, because if northern Italy is taken, then that opens up southern Germany for an Allied assault, which they cannot do. After the British sort of screw up their part of the landings for Avalanche, if you've ever listened to the album The Wall by Pink Floyd, all the terrible stuff that happens in that with his dad dying happens as a result of Operation Avalanche. Fun fact, go listen to The Wall. It's a great album. But slowly, when the Italians drop out, the Germans are going to retreat very, very slowly. The big battle there is called Monte Cassino. That's here, where the Germans hole up basically on the top of a mountain inside of an abbey and hold out against the Allied troops. It's going to end up being a joint effort between the Americans and the British, but also, not to be forgotten in there, are Polish exiles who fled Poland when Hitler was taking over and had come to the US or the UK, and they're now fighting in their own Polish units, and they do a bang-up job knocking the rest of the Germans out of Monte Cassino, and eventually they will come back to the UK and they'll help invade France as well. Now, the two most important things to come out of this, other than Patton getting in trouble and needing to redeem himself later on, are these two conferences that are going to happen. They're going to happen relatively quickly. Casablanca's in the fall, Tehran's in the winter. Casablanca is in Morocco, and there the Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt are going to agree to this concept of unconditional surrender. Stalin is a little busy at this time and is basically going to telecommute, but he's aware of it. But unconditional surrender. They will not let the Germans weasel their way out of this, nor can the Italians. They will have to totally say, we lost, we give up, do whatever you want. Nothing else will be accepted. And then the Tehran conference comes a couple months later. They literally leave from Casablanca and they go to Tehran, basically. Tehran is in Iran, and there the Allies commit to, yes, we will invade France. Joseph Stalin, we promise we'll do that. And the bigger deal here, especially as we get out of World War II and go into the Cold War next, is this right here. The Allies, the British and the Americans, are going to make a commitment to stay out of Soviet business after the war is over. It's really all they could say. Joseph Stalin is pulling the massive weight of basically holding down the Germans in Europe at this point, and they can't really tell him that that's not going to happen. This will end badly for everybody involved, except for Stalin. Stalin's going to make out like a bandit here. So that does it for 1943. Long story short, advances are made and people are prepared to take the next step to ensure the unconditional surrender of the Japanese and the Germans. The Italians were never really in question. So one more slide for today. And this is what is happening in Russia. I keep talking about Joseph Stalin in Russia. I'm going to go through this briefly. I will not put this on your test. Stalingrad might be an extra credit question, and you'll see why in a second. So I will go through this quickly. Again, if you have questions or want me to go into more depth later this week, I will set up like a YouTube live thing, and you guys can ask me questions on there and I can go into more detail. But let's roll through this real quick. Remember, the Germans invaded Russia in September 1942, which was September 41. Incredibly bad idea. And the Russians are initially pushed back by the German blitzkrieg all the way to Moscow. So almost to the capital. Like, there's literally debates happening as to whether or not they need to burn Moscow down, like when Napoleon invaded in 1812. Stalin is 5 minutes away from leaving before the Germans are briefly repulsed and Moscow is safe again. So August 1942 is where the tide will slowly begin to turn in favor of the Russians. This is going to be a long battle. It's going to go from August to February of the next year. And Stalingrad is a major city in southwestern Russia. It's a manufacturing center. They were the ones that made tractors and basically industrial equipment for Russia. The entire city is almost completely taken by a German attack called Operation Blue. And Stalin basically pushes all of his chips into the middle of the table and says, this is it. We have to win here. All Russian troops, we're pushing you down there. We're getting together the generals that we can. We're sending them down there. We're making a plan. Hold on. We'll get you everything we can. The Russians are not super well prepared for this. You've probably heard about this before or seen it in movies where Russian soldiers are basically being ferried across a river to Stalingrad. Stalingrad's on a river on the west side of the river. So the Russians are driving these guys across in boats that are being shelled by the Germans. Then they land. One in every 2 or 3 soldiers is given a gun. The other 2 are given rounds of ammunition and basically said, hey, pick up the gun from the first dead Russian you see because we don't have enough to give you all one, and it would be a waste otherwise. If these Russian conscripts turn around, they are going to be shot by what are called commissars, which are members of the Communist Party looking to enforce the rules. The battle will bog down in the city. This is brutal house-to-house fighting, and I mean this in the most literal sense. Like, there are literally houses in Stalingrad you can still go visit today that have names because of people holding out at them. They would drag anti-aircraft guns into basically like a garage and fire out at troops that were attacking them from there. It's insane. Eventually, the Russians will prepare what's called Operation Uranus, and what this will see is the Russians are going to hold on, because winter in Russia is terrible. It gets incredibly cold. They're on the steppe, which means basically, for our purposes, imagine like North Dakota, where it is just flat and there is wind blowing and it is sub-zero every single day. There's nowhere to really hide from the snow or the cold or the whipping wind. And as this happens, the Russians are going to have another army gather. So an army is the biggest unit of military you can get. And they are going to encircle the entirety of the German army. So now the Russians are both in Stalingrad pushing out at the Germans, and they are around the Germans pushing in. And the Germans are caught in a vice. They're trapped, they're frozen, they're starving, they're overmatched. The Russians finally are starting to get their production up and running again. They are better supplied, they know the land better, and they also are starting to engage in what is called sniper warfare. This gentleman right here, his name is Vasily Zaitsev. He is one of a number of famous Russian snipers who just goes around basically assassinating anybody of any sort of rank in the German military and taking them out. At the same time, the rest of the Russian troops are engaged in house-to-house fighting, usually led by people that lived or worked in Stalingrad. So like, hey, I know this factory, and you would spend 3 weeks fighting over a factory. Blowing down walls with bazookas, throwing grenades through, and then charging in with submachine guns. Just absolutely savage fighting. By the end of this, the Germans know things are not going well. The German troops know things are not going well when on Christmas they listen to a German radio broadcast and it's like, hey, everything's going great in Stalingrad, rest of Germany, and the German troops who are about to be, killed or captured by the Russians are like, no, it's not. You're all lying to us. The lead general runs away, gets on a plane and flies out at the behest of Adolf Hitler. So the Red Army, the Russians are going to destroy the entire German army. And then once they are resupplied and the Germans that they have captured are sent off to work camps in Siberia, they are going to start their slow, methodical march towards Berlin across Eastern Europe. To put this in perspective for you, I'll start putting casualty numbers up for the 44 stuff. 1.1 million Russian casualties here. Not all of those, again, are killed. We've discussed casualties just means unable to continue to fight, so that could be frostbite, losing feet, that could be injuries, or that could be deaths. The Axis, I'd say this is Axis because while led by the Germans, there are still like Romanian and Bulgarian and some Italian troops fighting here too. Between 650 and 850,000 Axis casualties. We're not sure because the Germans say, oh, we got some people out, and also the Russians don't admit to working some people to death or executing people, so you don't have a great count for how many of the Axis actually died, but it is a lot. But 1.1 million casualties in a 6-month battle. The follow-up to this is actually a pair of battles called Operation Citadel and then the Kursk. But to put it briefly here, the Kursk is about a month-long tank battle that follows up Stalingrad. The Germans try to push back against the Russians. The Russians basically take this punch right on the jaw and then send in all of their tanks with troops behind them. So these are Russian T-34 tanks. The Russians are producing as much as they can. The Americans are sending them raw materials. We are also sending them stuff like Jeeps. So the Russians are making their own weapons at this point, but basically the bullets that go into those weapons and the stuff like the trucks that they use to transport those weapons to the front, those are made through American Lend-Lease stuff. So they're going to hold off this German counterattack, Operation Citadel, and then the Battle of the Kursk will destroy Germany's last attempt to really damage Russia. All the German generals blame each other, and the Russians just keep grinding away through Eastern Europe. Sheer force in numbers, human and mechanical, are going to win this war for the Russians. This is another great example of that. Just like Stalingrad, just so many people. In this case, you're looking at about 420,000 Russian casualties to 160,000 Axis casualties. The Russians are just going to keep pumping warm bodies in until this basically tide of Russians overwhelms the Axis powers. If you were in any way, shape, or form believed to have worked with the Germans at this time, horrible things were going to happen to you by the Russian army. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to 1945. And then this is our one sort of look forward into 1944. before we dive into it in our next slides, in the next video I'll put up. Russia sort of takes off the gas once they get into Poland. And they're going to move very slowly because they realize that the Germans are killing a lot of the leaders of the Polish government and the Polish resistance. And that will make life a lot easier when the Russians want to take over Poland after the war. So kind of a creepy, gross note to end on, but that is the calculation that is going on in Joseph Stalin's mind at this point, is he has sacrificed millions of Russian troops and civilians at this point to continue to push forward with the war, to continue to fight against Adolf Hitler. He believes that he deserves all of Eastern Europe and he wants to have an easy time with it when the war ends. So I want you to remember these numbers more than anything when we get to the final conferences of the war and making out a plan for what the post-war world is going to look like and what Joseph Stalin feels he's entitled to and why he feels he's entitled to that stuff. As I said earlier, I don't think I will actually put this on a test, but Stalingrad certainly seems like a great extra credit question. I would argue, as I alluded to earlier, that Stalingrad is the most important battle in the European war, just like Midway was the most important in the Pacific. Stalingrad is what turns the tide. It pushes Hitler back, allows Stalin to get a foothold and push forward, and buys the US, the UK, the Canadians, to a lesser extent the French, the time to attack from the other side. But Stalingrad is the moment when Hitler should have realized, oh no, I'm screwed. But he doesn't, because he's crazy and he's on a bunch of amphetamines at the time, and he's a lunatic and a horrible person. So there you go. I realized that was a long one, but I felt that the Russians needed to be talked about even in a U.S. history class. So thanks for hanging in there, and we'll have some more stuff up later in the week. All right, see you folks.